But what you just read, Jordan, emphasizes exactly what he was speaking about in the previous page, that everyone has their own boundaries of consciousness. For example, our boundaries of consciousness in society, and this is what the example that he used in the previous page, is cannibalism. We still can't even fathom the concept of cannibalism. Thank God. It's completely outside of consciousness. That's the evil that, in a way, stands right there at the boundaries. We haven't let it in. But the greater the tzaddik you are, the more complete of the tzaddik you are, the maybe the sharper and the narrower your boundaries are for evil, to the point that you can't even entertain an evil thought if you're a complete tzaddik. That's how your boundaries are drawn. But okay, I'm sorry, let's continue. Thus, the incomplete tzaddik.
Okay. Thus, the incomplete tzaddik is one who does not hate the sitra achra with an absolute hatred. Therefore, he also does not absolutely abhor evil. And as long as the hatred and abhorrence of evil are not absolute, there must remain some vestige of love and pleasure in it, meaning that the soiled garments have not entirely and absolutely been shed. As a result, the evil has not been utterly transformed into good, since it still has some attachment to the soiled garments. It is only that it is nullified because of its minute quantity and is accounted as nothing. Therefore, such a person is called a tzaddik to whom the evil within him is subjugated and abnegated.
Right. So the greater the tzaddik you are, the more you despise evil. Because if you don't despise it, that means you have some vulnerability towards it. And you haven't completely rejected it. So that means you're not complete yet. You're not a complete tzaddik yet. That's what this is saying. But by the way, this reminds me, if I may take this slightly in a different direction, but it reminds me of a Mishnah that I think is very much connected to this big idea, even though on the surface it might not seem connected. But this is the great argument between Rabbi Akiva and two other sages on the question of what is a good ground for divorce. What's a good ground for divorce? Are you allowed to divorce your spouse for anything? So there's three opinions. Rabbi Akiva seems to be a strange one. But that's exactly the point I want to make here and connect it to the complete tzaddik. One opinion is that you're allowed to divorce your spouse if she or he what's the word? Ikdichat tafshilo. If she or he burnt your dinner. If the cooking wasn't good enough, then you're allowed to divorce your spouse. That's one opinion. Another opinion is matzah ba'ervat davar, that if you found, God forbid, something that's abhorrent in your spouse. And now the question is, of course, how do you define abhorrent? What is something abhorrent? But it might be something really that's forbidden, at least according to the Torah, or maybe even more so. But anyway, so if you find something abhorrent in your spouse, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is an interesting one. Rabbi Akiva says, "Afilu matzah isha na'ah hemena." Even if someone found a more handsome or prettier spouse than a prettier person than your spouse, then you're allowed to divorce your wife or your husband. Now, how absurd is that? If that's the ground for divorce, then everyone would be divorcing. Sometimes we find people that are more handsome than my husband or prettier than my wife. So does it mean if I find a woman that's prettier than my wife, I can divorce my wife? What is Rabbi Akiva trying to say here? And really, I mean, the other two opinions we can understand. This opinion is completely beyond our reach. But the point of Rabbi Akiva is the point that Rabbi Steinsaltz is saying here, of course, commenting on the Tanya itself, the point that the Tanya is making. And that is that my love should be so absolute that the entertaining an idea that there might be a woman that is prettier than my wife, and even allowing that idea to enter my consciousness creates a crack. Yes, even though it might be a very small crack, but still creates a crack in my love, in my relationship, in my wholesome bond with my spouse. Because if it was truly wholesome, I wouldn't even be thinking, it wouldn't be a consciousness of comparing other women to my wife. But if I am already entertaining that idea, there's a crack. It points to a crack. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva again says, there's ground for divorce here. Same with God. If my love with God is so absolute, so complete, I wouldn't even entertain the idea of evil or of an evil thought. An evil thought that stands opposite God. The fact that I entertain it means that my love is not complete. And therefore, I'm not a complete tzaddik yet. My love with God must be so wholesome, so pure, and again, so one, that nothing strange to God can even enter that space. Not the space in my action, certainly, not in my speech, and certainly not in my thoughts. And that's really what a complete tzaddik is all about, to better explain that, to sharpen this idea. Again, I welcome any comments or any questions, suggestions. Otherwise, we can continue. Especially if you're a complete tzaddik, you have better insight than I do, because I'm not there yet. So please feel free to share your mind if you're a complete tzaddik. Amy, I see you raising your hand. Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to backtrack here a bit.
Yeah.
You were talking about divorce and something that is abhorrent. Are you comfortable talking about how you define or what the Tanya says about what is considered abhorrent?
Right. So the word in Hebrew is ervat davar, which literally is usually translated as abhorrent, something abhorrent. But to go according to the most simplistic commentaries, erva is usually a word used in the context of sexual relationships. And here, this is saying that your spouse engaged in a forbidden sexual relationship. So that's the simplistic commentaries. Now, it could be an actual physical relationship. It could just be even a verbal relationship. But still, that's usually the definition of erva, of abhorrent in the Torah. Some other commentaries expand on that. And they say that abhorrent might be not something, of course, abhorrent physically, abhorrent spiritually we're speaking about. Abhorrent in the ways of her values, or his values, in the ways of Torah principles. That a great violation was made, and that might be abhorrent. But those are the two different commentaries. One is more specific and one is more general. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for the question. Anyone else, please? Again, feel free to unmute yourself.
I think a real tzaddik would eat the burnt food and be grateful.
Yeah.
And say Birkat Hamazon after that.
That's true. Maybe a real tzaddik wouldn't even know how real food should taste. So for him, it's the same. Yes. Good point. Okay. All right, let's continue then. Let's continue. The incomplete tzaddik behaves like a complete tzaddik in every way. Does anyone want to continue to read? Unless it's you again, Jordan, or mind. Whoever jumps on it.
Okay.
Okay, please.
The incomplete tzaddik behaves like a complete tzaddik in every way. He too has passed the stage of inner doubt, torment, and struggle. He too is not tempted by evil and experiences no urge for anything not holy. The difference between them is in their innermost heart of hearts, in the ultimate transformation of evil to good. The incomplete tzaddik differs from the complete tzaddik in that he has not yet achieved this quintessential transformation. Thus, although he worships God in all his deeds and ways, he worships him without feeling an utter hatred for evil, not because he is likely to sin, God forbid, but because he still contains the idea of something contrary to godliness, albeit in the most subtle and diminished of forms. The second channel of possible expression of the forces of his soul still exists within him.
Right. Accordingly, just complete that line here.
Accordingly, his love of God is also not ultimate, and he is thus called an incomplete tzaddik.
Right. Which, by the way, reminds me of that famous verse that Chatati negdi tamid, that King David says in the book of Psalms. He says that I have sinned against God always, tamid. Now, the question is, of course, no one, even King David, certainly not King David. No one is in a perpetual state of sin. What does this mean? Chatati negdi tamid. I have sinned against you always. What does that mean? And the simple commentary again is that there is the opportunity for sin always. I don't allow myself to actualize that opportunity, but that sin is always there. Or in the words of his son, King Solomon, lefetach chatat rovetz, another verse in I think it's in the book of Proverbs, in Mishlei, but that says that sin is knocking at your door. In other words, you're not opening the door, but it's still knocking there. And the recognition that sin is there is also what stops you very often from sinning. Knowing that, yes, you still have that inclination within you, if you're an incomplete tzaddik or lower, that is knocking from time to time. You will refuse to open the door. And indeed, an incomplete tzaddik closes the door 24/7. The door is completely sealed, but still the sin is knocking. By a complete tzaddik, the sin doesn't knock at all. That verse doesn't even apply. Lefetach chatat rovetz, or the verse of chatati negdi tamid, I've sinned against you always. It doesn't even exist, doesn't even knock. It's not even there. He lives in a completely different world, in a completely different house. There's no knock of evil there. And that's really what this is saying. Now, everyone else has to live with the idea that, yes, sin can be, God forbid, a potential force that we have to reject each and every time. And I think that's why there's so much emphasis here in chapter 10 on complete tzaddik, even though most of us, I don't know about you again, but certainly myself, most of I and many do not reach that level of the complete tzaddik. But it's emphasizing that so that we understand how to compare the two, the complete tzaddik from the incomplete tzaddik, because even though one may think that he's reached such a level, and very often we have these days of, I call them days of haughtiness, where we think that, oh, we've conquered our evil, we're good people. And that's fine. We have to sometimes pat ourselves on our shoulders, and we need healthy self-esteem too. But sometimes it gets to us too much. And that's when we fall, because that's when we drop the idea that sin is knocking at the door. And being cognizant of it is really what stops us from sinning. So that's why the great emphasis on the complete tzaddik versus the incomplete tzaddik, to remind us that as long as we haven't achieved the level of complete tzaddik, there's still some vulnerability within us, and therefore we have to be extra careful. But that's the idea here. You know, the famous Hasidic story of I think we've mentioned this in the past, of Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, one of the great Hasidic masters of 250 years ago, who asked his students to carry 2 notes in the 2 pockets of their coats, of their suit, or whatever or their pants, or whatever they may be wearing. In one pocket, there should be the note that quotes Abraham, who said, who said to God, I am but dust and ashes. And in the other pocket, they should carry a note that quotes the ethics of our fathers. It says, Bishvili nivra olam, that the entire world was created for me. Now, why? Why should we carry these 2 notes in 2 different pockets of our pants or suits? And Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa explained, because if sometimes we feel too lowly and we're beating ourselves up too much, then we should take out the note that says that the world was created for me. We have a mission to accomplish. God has entrusted us with it, and we have to elevate the entire world. Stop beating yourself down. If we feel too haughty, too arrogant, if we think we know it all and we've done it all, then we should take out the other note that says, I'm but dust and ashes. And in a way here, chapter 10 of the Tanya that speaks about the incomplete tzaddik versus the complete tzaddik is a strong reminder of that idea, that if I feel like I've reached the highest of height, that I'm a complete tzaddik, hey, you're but dust and ashes. You still have a long way to go. That's the reminder here of chapter 10.
It should be a 3rd pocket.
Oh, go for it. What should that say? What note should we carry in that?
Benuni. I'm
right.
a mediocre person trying to improve.
That's right. Very good. Yeah, that's the healthy balance between those two notes. That's right. Or as the Rambam calls it, the Rambam was a big fan, and he speaks about it a lot, both in his foreword to the Mishnah and also at the very beginning of his 14 volumes, the Mishneh Torah, and the laws of the foundations of the Torah, Yesodat Torah, and Hilchot Deot, the laws of different minds that exist in humanity. But he speaks about, he coined the term, Maimonides coined the term of Derech HaEmtzai. Doesn't appear before the Rambam. But Derech HaEmtzai means the middle way, the middle path. The middle path, which means that can't go to any extreme in general in life, certainly not in this. Don't be just dust and ashes, and don't be just too arrogant to say that the whole world is just for me. Find that third pocket, Derech HaEmtzai. Even though, and I don't mean to deviate here, even though the Kotzker Rebbe, who was known as a very fiery Hasidic Rebbe, very extreme in many ways, very harsh too, he once called his student to the window of his house. And back then, obviously, there weren't any cars. People were going from place to place with horses and wagons. And he pointed to the street, and he told his student, "What do you see on the sides of the street?" He says, "What do you mean?" "I see human beings walking on sidewalks." He says, "Good. And what do you see in the middle of the street?" He says, "I see horses pulling wagons." He says, "Well, remember, that's a lesson for life. If you're just a middle guy trying to please everybody, then you're like a horse. If you want to be a mensch, if you want to be a human being, then you got to pick one side. Go to the right side or to the left side." But this was relating more, not really to the Derech HaEmtzai of the Rambam. This was relating more to the people who are inconclusive in everything, or they try to please everybody, or they're everywhere. As the Roman Emperor Nero once said, Nero apparently was Jewish. He converted to Judaism according to the Talmud. But he said that if you're everywhere, you're nowhere. And I think that's what the Kotzker Rebbe was trying to say here. So the middle ground here, Derech HaEmtzai, really relates to the third pocket, as you were saying, William, to finding a healthy balance between those two pools in the human soul. But it doesn't relate to trying to be everywhere. It's really just trying to find that balance between those two pools. Okay, let's continue. Unless again, please, don't forget to speak your minds too, or your hearts, even better. Okay, so let's continue. The incomplete tzaddik is one who serves God with his every deed, word, and thought. Does anyone want to read? Unless Jordan, you want to continue, please.
All righty. The incomplete tzaddik is one who serves God with his every deed, word, and thought, but he is serving him with only part, albeit the greater part, of his soul. The remainder is there, but does not participate. It has been silenced, but not converted to a positive force in his divine service. His love of God is thus incomplete, for it is fueled by less than 100% of his potential, by less than the combined forces of his godly and animal selves.
Right. Now, let's continue. Let's continue a little more. Now this level
is subdivided into myriads of degrees in regard to the quality of the minute evil remaining from any of the four evil elements.
Mm-hmm.
Only one type of complete tzaddik exists, the person who possesses not the slightest vestige of inner evil, having effected its complete conversion into good. In contrast, the incomplete tzaddik still has some evil in himself. Evil comes in many types and forms, making for many types and degrees of incomplete tzaddik, defined by the quality and quantity of evil still in him.
Right. Let's stop there for a second. So I just don't want to clarify. I want to clarify here. It's an important idea that even from the previous page here, of the minute evil remaining from any of the four evil elements, If you recall, in chapter 1 in the Tanya, we speak of 4 evil elements that are really based on the 4 matters that were used to create this world, that are found in this world, that sustain this world in many ways. The 4 matters are earth, wind, fire, and water. And these really relate to the 4 different evils that exist in this world. Let's start with earth, the soil. Soil is what pulls us down, depression, sadness, any disbelief in oneself, in one's ability again to bishvili nivra olam, to change the world, lack of esteem. That's what earth represents. It's that spirit that pulls us down all the time. The second element is wind. Wind is that evil force that blows a lot of hot air within us. It's arrogance. It's that feeling that we think that we've got it all. Maybe that's why people say that those types of people are full of it, full of wind, full of air, hot air. So that's wind. The third element is fire. Fire is very destructive, just like anger. Anger is also a type of fire. It's a passion gone wrong. And it explodes and it destroys. That's another type of evil. And the fourth one is water, and that's pleasures. Water brings pleasures. Everyone loves swimming, being in water, showering. And that's forbidden pleasures, like sexual pleasures, or even food pleasures that are consumed just for the sake of pleasure itself. So that's another type of evil. So the four evil elements that one is speaking of, that the Tanya is speaking of here, relates to those specific elements. And what this is saying is that the complete tzaddik has had the great privilege and ability to completely eradicate any type of evil coming from those 4 elements. In other words, there's no depression or sadness or those feelings. There's no arrogance. There's no anger. There's no pleasure for pleasure's sake. That's the complete tzaddik, not in his actions, not in his speech, and not in his thoughts, and not in, as Rabbi Steinsaltz call it, not even in his heart of hearts. That's the complete tzaddik. So I just wanted to clarify what those 4 elements relate to. But let's continue, maybe just a little bit more, since I stopped you in the middle of the sentence, Jordan. We might differentiate them by quantity. Go for it, Jordan.
I kind of lost my place here.
Top of page 258. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Here it is. Yeah.
Only one type?
So it's the last sentence of that first paragraph.
Yeah. Okay, got it. We might differentiate them by quantity.
Right.
As well as in regard to its proportionate abnegation by reason of its minuteness, such as, by way of example, 1 in 60, or in 1,000, or in 10,000, and the like.
Right.
Our author,
Continue.
Our author is employing the terminology of halacha, where a small amount of forbidden food that is accidentally mixed in with permitted food may in some cases be considered as negligible and non-existent if it is less than 1 part in 60, and in some cases if it is less than 1 part in 100, and so on. Halachically, these might not result in different degrees of nullification. When a thing is nullified, it is nullified, but different substances require different percentages for a nullification to occur at all. Similarly, there is no practical difference between an incomplete tzaddik whose evil is nullified by 60 and one whose evil is nullified by 1,000. In either case, the evil has been suppressed to the point that it has no effect on his behavior or his inclinations. But in terms of the person's inner truth, in terms of the quality of his love for God and his proximity to his ultimate perfection, there are differences between lesser and greater ratios of nullification.
Right. We can dive into this more next week, but I think it's a brilliant analogy because indeed, in Jewish law, there are laws of nullifications, as this is saying. So the more famous one, there are many others, by the way, but the more famous one is the one that speaks about the mixture of meat and milk. As we all know, we're not allowed to mix meat and milk. But if there's a 60th, if by mistake, say a drop of milk fell in a dish in a soup of meat, for example, right? If there's 60 times the amount of meat soup against that drop of milk, then I am allowed to consume that meat, that soup, because again, it's completely nullified. That drop of milk didn't affect the meat whatsoever. There's no mixture there whatsoever. So, but there needs to be 60 times the amount of soup, of meat soup, again, against the drop of milk. There are other halachic qualifications as regarding nullifications. The most extreme that I can think of is chametz. Chametz on Passover. We're not allowed to have any type of leavened bread. What if one drop of leavened bread falls into a kosher for Passover dish? While the law in Passover is that afilu b'mashu, nothing can nullify even a drop of chametz. That whole dish needs to be thrown. No nullification whatsoever when it comes to chametz. But that's the most extreme. And then there are many other degrees in between. But the reason he's using this analogy is because in a way that's the difference between the incomplete tzaddik and the complete tzaddik. The incomplete tzaddik nullified the evil. But that drop of evil might still have permeated his heart of hearts. Still there. It's completely nullified. Like that drop of milk is completely nullified by that meat soup. The complete tzaddik, on the other hand, had nothing permeate his heart of hearts. No evil. Doesn't even need to be nullified because it didn't enter in the first place. That's the big idea here. And by the way, this expresses itself also, and maybe that's another lesson we ought to learn from this, and we'll conclude with this thought, but it expresses itself also in our very devotion to God on a day-to-day basis. Because very often, as we so often mention, we are devoted to God maybe 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day. It's 24 hours a day. So we do a mitzvah we pray, we do this mitzvah, that mitzvah. If we had to quantify it in hours, maybe it's 4 hours, 5 hours. The complete tzaddik is devoted to God 24/7, 24 hours a day. There's not one, even when he sleeps, he's devoted to God. If he sleeps at all, sleeps very little. But still, he's there. Why? Because there's no iota of differentiation, of separation from God. That's what it means. Now, I'm thinking that the other lesson we can draw from this chapter, even though again we are not complete, I'm not a complete tzaddik, because many of us are not a complete tzaddik, is that if we can at least strive to be like the complete tzaddik and to increase the number of minutes and hours in the day in which we are devoted completely to God. It might not be 24 hours like the tzaddik, but it can be a few more hours than we're doing right now, a few more minutes than we're doing right now. I think that's really the goal, and that's how we can reach the ultimate level. But I have to mention also that this coming Thursday is the 29th yahrzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and it's quite amazing because his influence is only expanding, even though he hasn't been physically with us for 29 years. And that's the mark, I think, of a great person, of a true leader. But he was a man who taught us how to be devoted to God and to God's children 24/7. So if we can't do that 24/7, let's try and increase that, at least in his loving memory, by a minute, 2 more minutes. Try to quantify the hours in which you are a complete tzaddik during the day, and then add another minute to it, 5 minutes or an hour. I think that should be the goal of every human being and of every life altogether. We must grow from strength to strength always. Because as the Rebbe would say, every living thing must grow, just like trees. Every living thing must grow.